everyone. Thank you so much for joining #Webinar Wednesday, presented by College Greenlight, powered by CapEx.com, a professional development webinar series for the college access and admissions community to identify best practices to support first-generation low-income students in the college-going process. Yale University is joining us today for today's topic, applying to and affording college in the age of COVID-19. And as I mentioned before, I am your host, Brittany Cleveland, Senior Manager of Partner Engagement here at collegegreenlight.com, where we support the needs of over 15,000 registered college access counselors and 200 leading colleges and universities across the nation, providing online college and admission scholarship resources for first-gen underrepresented college-bound students. Launched in 2012 by CapEx.com, our mission continues to close the information gap and opportunity gap across access counselors, students, and families. And if you're new to our community, well, hello, welcome. We want you and your students to create a free account at capx.com/greenlight-students. And once you all complete that, you'll gain access to our user-friendly online tools to help students find scholarships to pay for school, research diversity admissions programs, and explore virtual campus tours. And if you need any help creating your accounts, go ahead and just type help in the chat box to your right or contact our team, info@collegegreenlight.com, to get started. Now, to maximize today's webinar, we have some housekeeping tips and a couple of goodies. So our first goodie coming up is next week, College Greenlight. We're hosting our online college block party, Careers and Majors Edition. This will be next Wednesday, October 16th, and next Wednesday, October 14th, and Thursday, October 15th, a 2-day online conference dedicated to first-gen students. All high school students, counselors, and parents are invited to gain expert advice from college reps and current college students about how to explore their college options and learn how to best differentiate majors and programs that can support their needs and career goals. We'll be exploring different topics around liberal arts, colleges, health sciences, engineering, social justice, and aviation programs. Registration is available now, and I provided a link at the bottom for you all to receive more details. And for housekeeping tips, use the chat box to your right or bottom of your screen to add comments. And if you have any questions, leave your question in the Ask a Question feature. And also, you all can upvote questions just in case you see someone who already has it. And if you need to leave early, we will send those slides and a recording of the webinar for you to review within 24 hours. And please, sharing is caring. Forward it over to your students and colleagues as an additional resource. All right, team. So let's go ahead and get started. Coming to the stage, we have our amazing Yale panel. Joining us is Scott Wallace-Judas, Director of Undergraduate Financial Aid, Wendell Wallace-Judas, Assistant Director of Admissions, Eddie Chibanu, Senior Assistant Director of Admissions, and then additionally, Corin Smith from Admissions is joining us in the chat answering your questions. All right, team, enough for this very lengthy introduction. Let's go ahead and have you introduce yourself. Welcome to the stage.
There we go. All righty. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here with us. We'll just do quick intros again, and then we'll jump right in. My name is Eddie Chibanu. I'm here on behalf of the admissions office, joined by my two wonderful colleagues. I read for different parts of the country. I read for Arizona, Northern California, as well as the Bronx and parts of Massachusetts. So I think the first counselor was Andrea from Arizona. So special shout out to you, but hello and welcome to everyone here.
Hi, and I am Wendell Wallace-Judas. I currently read for Southern California, everything south of LA, with the exception of Riverside and LA. And I also read for Fresno and Bakersfield. I'm happy to be here. I'm glad all of you are able to join us today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Wallace Judas, and I am the Director of Undergraduate Financial Aid here at Yale University. Financial aid will read for the entire country, so I will give a special shout out to everybody. I did see, I think it was Mary from down the road in Connecticut, so just to give her a call out in Bridgeport. But I'm a first generation college student from rural Western Nebraska. So I grew up in a town of 350 people, depending on how liberally you want to count. So I bring that experience. Pleasure to join you all today.
Awesome. So we just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the admission side of it, and then also the financial aid side of it, on how COVID is impacting our processes, and thinking about the new challenges, thinking about how we're going to conduct sort of our work, our collective work in this upcoming year together. And then we want to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So don't be shy. That's why we're here. We're going to leave a lot of time for that. But some of these things, go without saying. I think we're all aware of the situation that COVID has placed all of us in. And then especially a lot of the students that we work with, that you all work with, we see that COVID has disproportionately impacted low-income communities, communities of color as well, in terms of work, in terms of health outcomes. So we recognize that. We want to sort of mention these things explicitly, that this is an unprecedented time that we are facing in our country and in our world. And so we know that there's so much that looks different this year, both for the students and for all the counselors here who are juggling everything that's going on with the uncertainty of school reopening plans or contingency plannings, to the things that you have going on in your own households with potentially, working from home and navigating, family responsibilities. There's a lot that's going on, and we're sensitive to that. We're mindful of that, and sort of how this might play into the recommendation letters that you might be writing on behalf of students, and sort of the circumstances and the situations that students are facing. So we've been hearing, as I'm sure you have been hearing, a lot of student concerns from as a result of everything that's going on. Some schools may have opted to a pass-fail system or some sort of different grading system. We all know what's going on with the College Board and the ACT, with sort of testing debacles and everything that's happening there. I want to emphasize here, we'll get more into it, but I want to emphasize here that we're test optional for this year for seniors who are applying to enter in fall of 2021. We'll get a little bit more into that as well, but that is one of the top questions that we're getting in our office from both counselors and from students, and we recognize a lot of the challenges that students are facing there. We also are sensitive to the fact that students just can't do the things that they've historically done. From the past 6 to 8 months, a lot of things have changed. A lot of extracurriculars have been canceled. Some may have been able to be reimagined with social distancing protocols in place. But we also see that a lot of, especially last year, a lot of year-end activities or culminating projects that students were anticipating sort of the completion of, that may not have come to fruition. So we're mindful and sensitive of that. We've been hearing that from students. And one thing that we want to be particularly sensitive to is sort of the responsibilities and the situations that a student is facing at home, whether it be family responsibilities, taking care of younger siblings who, trying to wrangle everyone together to have a stable internet connection, or to keep a younger sibling focused on their lesson planning. We see that students are almost becoming additional parents in the household, in terms of the care that's expected of them, while also having to balance and navigate their own work, their own responsibilities, their own homework assignments. It does place a lot on students. And then one thing that we're seeing as well is just the considerations that students might have on a willingness to be further away from home. We know that the pandemic has impacted the way that we travel. And so we're hearing concerns from students on whether they want to be further away from home or not, in the type of college environment that they want to be in. So we recognize all of these concerns. We want to sort of speak to them. But more importantly, we want to speak to the way that our process sort of will function in this upcoming year. Oh, Wendell, I don't know if we can hear you. Oh, there we go. There we go. Now we can hear you.
Good. All right. Just as Eddie stated, we have unusual circumstances this admission cycle, but consistency in the review process remains the same. At Yale, we will continue to review students' applications within their context. As part of our whole person review, we, as other colleges and universities similar to Yale, will be looking at the individual impact COVID-19 may have had on an applicant. Any major disruptions should be made known to the admissions officer. This can be done within the application or email so that it is documented in the student's file. Whether you use the term whole person or holistic review, more and more institutions are on this train. For those institutions that rely heavily on testing in application review, now more than ever, performing whole person review is incredibly important due to test site accessibility and score reporting issues. Amidst all of the changes COVID has caused, the process at Yale remains the same. First, I would like to state that not all colleges and universities subscribe to the whole person review, but we do at Yale. In the standard pre-COVID whole person review, this is what the admission officer was looking at to determine if an applicant should move on to the next step in the process, which is the second read in our case. And also happens to be most of our applicants. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to give a brief explanation of each of these parts. First, background and context. Here we're looking at if a school is well-resourced, under-resourced, education level of the parents, home neighborhood, the neighborhood of the school, etc. This plays into us getting a complete picture of the student and where they're coming from exactly. Next, the academic record. What type of rigor has the applicant undergone in relation to what the school offers? Not every school offers the same thing. Not all students are able to, take the same course load for a variety of reasons. So we want to make sure that we are not comparing one student to another or students in one school to another school. We're looking at the individual student in comparison to what the school offers. All right. Next, involvement outside of class. Typically, this may be termed as extracurricular activities, but we wanted this to encompass everything about the student because there's more than just, sports and clubs. Yes, we look at those. We also look at if a student has a part-time job, if they're taking care of a younger sibling or an elderly grandparent or even a sick parent. All those things help to shape the profile of the student. Letters of recommendation should speak to the applicant's academic prowess and also their interpersonal skills. At Yale, we recommend letters of recommendation from 11th and 12th grade teachers because who the student was in 9th and 10th is very different than who they are in 11th and 12th. So we want something more recent that speaks to those things. Essays. The essays should be thoughtful, reflective, in the applicant's own voice, and it should be about them. All right. Sometimes students make the mistake of writing about someone who's influential to them, and then 95% of the essay is about that person instead of how that person impacted them and what type of change it's had on their lives. So those are things to tell your students. Testing. Some schools have hard minimums or ranges as to whether or not a student will be accepted. And this year, a number of schools have become test optional. At Yale, the testing is a piece that tells us if a student will be successful here. We don't have a minimum score required to apply. And like I said, it's just a piece of the puzzle. It's not the end all be all. Interviews. At some schools, students can or have to request interviews. Others may extend interviews to applicants. At Yale, we extend interviews, but not every student is guaranteed an interview, and that is due to availability. We have alumni who are gracious enough to volunteer their time to do interviews for us, but they're not able to get to 35,000 students because these people still have careers and families, and they have limited time as well. Now, here's the thing, not getting an interview is no reason to think that a student is denied admission to Yale. Every officer in our in undergraduate admissions will tell you there's a fairly large number of students who are admitted without interviews, okay? So don't tell your students, don't panic if someone in their school got an interview and they didn't, and they're thinking that they're not a viable candidate. That is not the case, okay? Interviews can go really well and they can go really, really bad. So, you know, if they get an opportunity to interview, as much as they can, try to encourage them to relax and just hold open dialogue, you know, and let their personality shine. Now, next slide. So as a result of test accessibility and standardized scoring issues, the testing component has been taken out of the whole person review for some institutions. This admission cycle, Yale is test optional. So we will not be looking or requiring testing from students. All right, next slide. Now the review looks more like this as a number of schools have become test optional for the current admission cycle. I stress again, not all schools are test optional. You must check with each school that is being applied to. Some schools have extended their test optional policy for the next 2 to 5 years. Others have made a permanent switch, while others have made no change at all. Yale is test optional for the current cycle, which are students that are entering the fall of 2021. For students planning on entering fall of 2022, testing will be considered as of now. Yale will make a decision about extending the test optional policy later in the academic year as we assess the COVID-19 spread and impact on the world, plus accessibility as it relates to the SAT and ACT. Whole person review remains the same for us, minus the testing piece. Whole person review is sound, and because of that, our process of reviewing applications remains unchanged. The best and brightest will continue to shine through, even without the testing. All right, back to you, Eddie.
Thank you, Wendell. So I just wanted to touch on a few things that might be helpful just really quickly before we turn it over to Scott. Students now, as you're familiar, have the opportunity to share a little bit more about their circumstances and their situations. So here we just wanted to highlight sort of both the common application and the coalition application question, COVID question specifically for students. And what I would generally say here is for students who have had sort of a significant disruption, there are this is really, I think, the place for students to note that, where they can share on the common application within 250 words, and then the coalition application is a 300-word limit. They can share really sort of what's been going on. That, as Wendell was talking about, is critical in our review of getting to know the student, their circumstances, their situation, and the context that they're coming from, both in their home environment and in the school environment. And so particularly for this, on the student side from their home environment, they have the option to really just let us know anything and everything that's been going on. These are check boxes, so they can select as many as are applicable to their situation. But I would really encourage students to utilize this section. We anticipate probably seeing a lot of responses and supplemental questions and such. If there's a situation, directing students to utilize the full extent of this essay, I think, is ideal. That way they can still talk about themselves and showcase their personalities in their essays. think about, how they might still talk about their passions and their interests in some of the supplemental materials. Again, they can still mention some of the COVID impact in other pieces. But if the bulk of it can sort of remain in this COVID specific question, they can leverage sort of the opportunities in the other parts of the application to then still really shine and get their personality through in the other application materials. And then there's also the opportunity for counselors to share more on the circumstances that each school might be facing. And so, as we mentioned sort of at the top, these are challenges that you have dealt with very closely and intimately. It's helpful and really necessary for us to know. So if things can be included in the school profile, that is the best case scenario, best situation. We use the school profile. We use that to interpret the student's transcript, to understand the grading system, to understand the course offerings available at the school, to understand unique situations within the school, again, academic situations or contextual factors within the school setting. And so please make sure, if possible, to update school profiles. But this also, this question specifically to counselors, both on the Common Application and the Coalition application, allows for counselors to just give a little bit more information for us. We will pay attention to this. We will look at it. If your school went to pass fail, for example, or whatever situations may have happened, if your school closed down, didn't have students were not able to have reliable internet access, things like that. Those are really important things for us to know. So please do let us know. Those are also things, again, as we encourage students to be self-advocates, those are important things for students to communicate with us, just to make sure we hear that and to reinforce that message that we want to know everything that might be going on in the circumstances a student is facing. Ultimately, we want to do our best to give a student a fair review in the admissions process, in the holistic review, and that background and context that Wendell was talking about is really, really key. So I'll shift it over to my colleague Scott to share a little bit more about the financial aid process.
Well, I think it's always really interesting in this time of COVID, as we're sitting here and we're talking about some of the changes or adjustments on the admission side of things. We also recognize on the financial aid side of things that family finances may have changed a lot as well. And, so as we begin to talk about the financial aid here, one thing that hasn't changed is the cost of college. And so for some families, that will remain a concern. And for other families, that concern has only been heightened by, the challenges in the world that we call 2020. And so today, as we start to talk a little bit about financial aid, we tried to take a step back and approach it from, some of our basic concepts about financial aid, the basic components of financial aid. We have sort of cut the real world examples. We'll talk a little bit about real world examples, but we've cut some of that. And then we're going to focus a little more on process and advice. And while I would generally say that process and advice may not be the most important component, I think in this COVID era, right, in the era of 2020, this, process is going to actually play a more important role in financial aid than it typically does. So, the first thing that I'd like to actually start on as we move to the next slide is talking about the types of financial aid programs that schools have available. And there are two main types, as many of you are aware. One of them is the need-based financial aid, and the other is merit-based financial aid. Touching briefly just on the merit-based financial aid program, you can see it's awarded based on student achievement. The funds may or may not be renewable, and they may have requirements in order to be renewed. One of the pitfalls of merit-based aid is that the amount typically doesn't change. So, a $5,000 scholarship on your entry year is still a $5,000 scholarship on your exit year. Now, we did list merit-based aid here, and I did want to at least touch briefly on it, although I then need to quickly come back and say Yale does not offer merit-based aid, and neither do many of the schools like Yale. There are some schools out there who do offer merit-based aid, and so we wanted to be sure to at least list it today in just terms of the general financial aid programs. Our financial aid program at Yale is really based solely on a family's demonstrated financial need. And that's where, in the age of COVID, where things can change for a family. So, if we were to take a look at need based aid, the biggest driving factor is obviously the family's ability to contribute towards college costs. So, we look at this as a partnership between families and between, families and students and also the university. And so, for us, our financial aid is solely awarded based off of families' ability to contribute. Students must renew their financial aid yearly, and what this means is, as a family situation, is their finances change from year to year, our financial aid can be responsive to this. So unlike merit-based financial aid, which is set and maintains, at the same amount from year to year, we're going to be able to adjust. So for current students who are here, they may have entered Yale with one financial aid award, and perhaps they were hit with one, or unfortunately maybe even two parents that have been impacted by COVID in their work or their income, or maybe it's their assets. Our financial aid program is able to respond to those changes in families. In general, Yale is going to meet 100% of a family's demonstrated need. We'll talk about some of that language in just a second. But if you're talking with your students about colleges and universities and their financial aid program in general, you'll want to talk to them about looking for schools that meet 100% of need, or understanding how that college or university meets the family's demonstrated need. So, one of the first concepts that I'd like to talk about on the next slide in relation to need based financial aid is this idea of a cost of attendance. And one of the first things that we need to help families understand is, what will it really cost me to attend X university, whether it's Yale or whether it's any other university? And we talk about the cost of attendance in two different ways. One is through billed expenses. So these are the expenses that are going to be, as the name suggests, billed by the college or university. They'll be billed directly to the student and family, and students and family will pay the college or university directly for these expenses. And they would be, as you see here, tuition, fees, the room and meal plan. There are some other things. Health insurance can sometimes be billed directly by the institution, and so forth. But the core expenses that we would consider as billed, that we account for in financial aid, are the four that you see listed here. On the right-hand side, you'll see unbilled expenses. Sometimes those might be referred to as indirect costs. These are ones that are not directly billed by the college or university, but students and families must have a grasp of them, must have an understanding of them in order to properly plan for finance in college. And those would be, estimated books and supply costs, personal expenses. I always tell the story about the toothpaste fairy no longer shows up in the closet. We have a 7-year-old here, and right now the tube of toothpaste is empty. He clearly drops it into the bucket and expects the next morning that there's more. Those things don't happen. And so students need to be planning for those extra expenses that might have been covered at their home. Students also are going to have to plan for getting to and from college. So the travel expense is also included in the cost of attendance, as are other things like health insurance. And there are some schools that include a few other things in their unbilled expenses as well. But when we're starting with need based financial aid, the first one that we always start with is that idea of cost of attendance. Next, in order to understand a need based financial aid program, we need to understand that there are really only two ways that college can be paid for. And the first one, which may seem pretty obvious, is students and families themselves. And the second way is financial aid. So when we go back to that concept of meeting 100% of demonstrated need, what that really means is, if you take the cost of the college, you subtract out what the family is calculated to pay, you subtract out the financial aid that is being offered by that school. If there is any money that is left, or any costs that are left, those are considered as unmet need, and somebody is going to have to still cover those costs. And in most cases, that's going to fall back to students and families. So to understand a little bit about paying for college, let's take a little bit of a closer look at these two areas. For students and families, as you can see here, there are two main components to that. Need-based financial aid is going to take into account and look at both parents and students, and we are going to look at both income and assets for both those groups. So another way to think about it is just parent and student, income and assets. And from those numbers, that's based on, the documentation that we are going to collect. We're going to analyze both of those areas of a family's finances, and we are going to establish what is considered an EFC, or an expected family contribution. And again, the unmet need portion is just as I indicated earlier, when you start with the cost of attendance and subtract out what the family is going to pay and what is covered by financial aid. In terms of financial aid, there are three main components of financial aid that I want to briefly touch on here as well. Because sometimes this can give students and families, it can be confusing to them when they receive a financial aid award, or when a financial aid officer or an admissions officer starts to talk about these sorts of things. It's presented in such a way we want to make sure that students and families don't think that it's all free money. So grants and scholarships, and sometimes those terms are used interchangeably, and essentially they mean free money. Typically, scholarships are based off of merit or abilities, and grants are usually based off of financial need. But I will also say that is not 100% true. But at the end of the day, whether it's a grant or a scholarship, it's money that does not have to be repaid by the student or the family. And that's the important point to remember. The other types of financial aid that students and families should be aware about is this idea of work study and student loans. So work study, there's really two components as well. Some schools will expect that a student would work over the summer and contribute a small amount towards their educational costs. And many schools, or most schools actually, will probably also assume that students are going to be working throughout the semester. And so many financial aid awards will take and show an amount of money that has been set aside for students to earn during their term time, or during the semester or the quarter. Student loans are, I'd really throw this into student and parent loans, because both students and parents have the ability to borrow through federal loan programs, through private banks, and in many cases, through the college or university themselves. Now, Yale does not offer student loans in their initial financial aid package. We believe that we meet 100% of what the family needs to come to school without offering any student loans, but we do have some students who do choose to borrow. Other schools might award student loans up front, and it's actually part of the financial aid expectation for that student. So those are some of the things that you'll want to have them take a look at. Quickly moving on to some of the financial aid advice that we would, offer to students and families. The first one is to get to know a financial aid officer. It's really easy because they'll be spending a lot of time on the admission side of things, sitting in on, and now it's even easier than ever to sit in on a Zoom or another type of virtual information session. They may have an interview that may be with an officer, it may be with alums. But it's pretty easy to shoot off questions when you start to think about what campus life is like, or what is the food like, or you're trying to get additional information. And I would offer the same advice for the financial aid officers as well, but just in the different area, right? So they are here to assist students and families through this process. So if you have a student who's interested in Yale, by all means, we would rather start working with a student, even pre-application, but definitely during the application cycle. And then ultimately, if the student is admitted, and we'd rather be working with the student and family all along, because at that way we're able to help them build a comprehensive financial plan for covering their costs. And there are lots of questions, and while the answers may be on the website, for some families they really need to be able to talk with us and talk through some financial questions. So don't think that you have to be an admitted student, or that you already have to be enrolled in order to speak with a financial aid officer. I would also say that students should really observe those deadlines. And so at Yale, our deadlines are more than suggestions, but they're not hard deadlines. So if a student were to miss a financial aid deadline, we will still evaluate their financial aid application and their eligibility for aid would not have changed because a student has missed our deadlines. Now, I'm not advocating for folks not to pay attention to our deadlines, but I'm just trying to put your mind at ease as well that if a student does miss a deadline, oftentimes we can still help them. That's not the same at every college or university in the country. So, for students and families, as they are going through the admission process, they're going to want to set up whether it's a separate Excel sheet, a separate tab, or a folder if they're old school. However, they want to do it, you're going to want to have financial aid and admissions deadlines tied together so that a family has an understanding of how those interact with each other. Non-custodial parents. We'll touch on this a little bit later. I have a separate slide, but I also wanted to provide it here. If a school is asking for just the federal form, which is that free application for federal student aid, non-custodial parent information is not going to be required. But at Yale and many schools like Yale that use the College Board, which is the CSS profile, it's another financial aid application that we ask students to complete. We are going to be asking for information from both the student's custodial and non-custodial parent. A non-custodial parent would be defined, well, let me actually do this the other way around. A custodial parent would be defined if a student's natural parents are separated or divorced, where the student lives more than 50% of the time. If that is exactly a tie and it is split down to the day, the hour, the minute, then you would go and you would utilize which parent contributes more than half of the student support. Those are the two questions that would determine custodial parents, and the non-custodial parent is the other. If your student is applying to Yale or other schools that require the non-custodial parent, and that parent has been absent for quite some time, there was case of abuse or neglect, long-term abandonment, have the student contact the school, and we may require some additional information, but we may also be able to waive this requirement when getting the non-custodial information is not appropriate. And then the other thing I just wanted to add here is that students should always request a review of their financial aid once they're admitted. And if the student finds and the family finds that, this is not what I was expecting, this is not something that I think is doable financially for our family, always have a conversation and we can ask for a review of the financial aid award. Come back to that in just a second. I know we're a little short on time, so I want to make sure we hit on two last concepts. One of them is how to be able to get an estimate of what a school may cost, including a school like Yale. And there are two main ways. Every school is required by the Department of Education to have a net price calculator, and it must be called net price calculator. So you're able to search on any school's website, and it should be within the first 2 or 3 clicks at a school's website. That's sort of like doing a financial aid application. You'll need a lot of information, but it'll spit back a fairly accurate response based on the information you added. There's also another easier way where you can do a quick college cost estimator. That just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? But you can just do this quick college estimator, which is going to ask about 6 or 7 questions, and it is going to provide a range. So students may know that they're not going to be paying sticker price likely, but that their cost is going to be somewhere in this range below. So there are 2 ways. It takes about 3 minutes or so in order to complete that estimator as well. So those are some ways that families can get estimates. And then just touching briefly to wrap up before we get to questions on some financial aid forms. So the first one that I would recommend is all students are going to have this for schools. It is the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid. I would underscore the word free there. So students should not have to pay to file this form. There are lots of good folks out there and some not so good folks who will help students file this form, may charge them $70 or $80 to do so, and then offer to also file any updates. A financial aid officer is going to do that exact same thing for you and not charge. It is a form that should be able to be filed for free. An important point for you to remember is that it's available after October 1st of every year. And so after October 1st of their senior year, students should file this. And they're going to be filing it with information from 2019 for next year. The second form that I would indicate that students are going to need to file is the CSS profile. And the CSS profile is required by many colleges that are private schools. There are about 400 almost, I think, the last that I knew. There is an application fee, and if your student qualifies for an SAT fee waiver, they will also qualify for a CSS profile fee waiver. If not, you could reach out to the school and ask them if they would provide a fee waiver for the student. It's also available after October 1st of the senior year. And then the final piece of advice that I would have to give is around financial aid forms and college specific forms rather. And many schools do have their own forms. Some require you to file tax returns, some have their own application with additional information, and you'll want to make sure that students are also paying attention to those forms as well. So I feel like I was racing through that, but I was cognizant of the time. We've already covered the non-custodial to the most part, and I would rather be able to spend an appropriate amount of time on questions that you have. We could take financial aid and talk for a long time, but I'd rather answer admission and financial aid questions that you all have. So, oh yes, there was one note that I did neglect to mention. The FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid, is going to be something that U.S. citizens, permanent residents, or eligible non-citizens should file. Otherwise, if your student is an international student, or if they are a DACA or they do not have DACA status, they are undocumented, those students would need to contact the individual school in order to know what to file. At Yale, we would require anybody to file the CSS profile. They would not need to file because they could not file the federal form. So students that are not documented can still receive aid at Yale, and we would just ask for their information via the CSS profile, and we would waive the FAFSA requirement for them. Okay, so I'm going to invite my colleagues back and see if we can get some questions. So far, it's been I see Corinne has answered some questions out there.
Yes, and I'm not sure if everyone is able to see the questions, but hopefully you can. I think maybe we'll just put this out there for everyone if you're not able to see the question box. But there was a great question that came in terms of the deferrals that we had this year, about 20% of the class, and how that's going to impact sort of the class of 2025. It will sort of, a short answer is that it won't, and we're thankful for that, where we're able to hear from sort of senior leadership in our office and at Yale that we're able to bring in sort of a full class of 2025 students, and then all of our students who deferred we'll just add them on top. And we'll have a slightly larger class of 2025 because of all the deferrals that will just be placed on top of the students. But we're thankful, at least definitely in the admissions office, to not have to have a smaller group that we can admit in this upcoming application cycle.
One of the questions out there as well that I think is definitely worth highlighting as well is there was a question about how will you allocate work study awards for a student who cannot work on campus due to COVID or pandemic or closures. And Corinne gave a fine answer, and we are very, very lucky at Yale. So students are still able to work a job. And as a matter of fact, as Corinne highlighted already, there are a number of actually new jobs on campus. So there are some jobs that no longer are relevant. If you're not, if there's no volleyball match, there's not going to, be need for students to be able to work a volleyball game. But there are other jobs that have come online because of this. The other thing that I would say is that for students who are studying remotely, Yale has made for this current year where we are covering that student share with additional grant assistance, so that if a student isn't able to find a job that is done remotely, that they would not be short on funding. I don't know that that will be our policy moving forward, but I think it's worth recognizing that the administration has been very open and very accepting of the idea that these are extraordinary times, and we've got to be sure to be there to support our students. And whether that's having a remote job, which may not in a general year be remote, or whether it's providing additional grant assistance for the student and family.
We had a question that just came in with respect to any feedback or advice for students who will need to apply for special circumstances this year. We can all imagine it will be higher this year along with verification.
Right. So in terms of the financial aid application, so any feedback or advice. So one of the reasons that we still use the CSS profile and that I'm a proponent of it, unlike the federal form, the FAFSA, which doesn't allow you to add any special circumstances, at least on the form in general, the CSS profile does allow and has a whole section for special circumstances. And so if you have special circumstances, a family can write those in their own words. They can provide additional documentation. And there are also going to be some COVID-related questions that are added to the CSS profile as well. And what my officers will do with that is, as we're reviewing with family, if we need more information or if we feel like there's something that is just missing from the standard numbers or forms that we get, we can reach out to those families and collect that additional information. I would also say, and I would also encourage, at least here at Yale, families should submit information if that's a separate letter. If it's, next year we're looking at 2019 taxes. But of course, COVID didn't hit the US until 2020. So if they want to send 2019 and give us 2020 with an explanation of what happened, that would be great. So I think being proactive, but I would also say, go back to one of my first comments, which is establish that relationship with the financial aid office and be sure and tell your story.
All right, we had another question come in about need blind and how that process works. Any applicant that's applying to us or to any institution that is need blind, the admissions office and officers do not see, nor do we care about the family's financial status. That information is sent directly to the financial aid office for their evaluation. So it is not a hindrance or an obstacle in the student's acceptance to the university.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add to that is, there are sometimes markers where we can sort of estimate whether a student might be lower income, and we are interested in actually recruiting students from lower income backgrounds. So if students are applying for a testing fee waiver, for example, again, they're not perfect indications, and so the full financial aid package will get reviewed by our financial aid officers. But I will say that we are interested in actually recruiting students from lower income backgrounds and diversifying our campus socioeconomically, recognizing that that has not traditionally been the case for Yale. And so we have a very large financial aid budget that I'm sure Scott knows very well. But we have a really large financial aid budget of, I think it's like around $180 million or so. Scott, correct me if I'm wrong there, where we allocate financial aid every single year to make Yale affordable for every family.
Right. And, the other thing that I would add to the need blind conversation is it's already been described, which is, absolutely the perspective that I see as well. One of the challenges that some families have is they say, aha, so if I want to make sure that the admissions office and the financial aid office aren't sharing information, so I'm going to hold off and I'm not going to supply my information yet. And, as you're working with students and families, I would highly encourage you to work with them on this understanding that it's information that is housed in different systems. There isn't a crosswalk between the two. And the challenge is that if a student is admitted and then decides to go through the financial aid process, there's time that it takes to fill out the paperwork. It's time for us to receive it and process it, all at our busiest point in time in the year where we're trying to work with, hundreds of other families. And so the response time can be low. There's not much time for a student if they request a review. It really hinders the process and for a student to be able to make a sound financial decision at that point in time as well. So I would encourage them to stick to the deadlines and file as early as they can, knowing that information isn't shared.
There was one that that our colleague Corinne had answered that I wanted to give a little bit more, sort of speak a little bit more to, but sorry, I lost my spot here in the question and answer. But for the added context in the COVID prompt, is there a preference if we write as an essay or as a list of information? However you can communicate this is totally fine, whether it's in essay format or a list of bullets or anything like that. You know, we also see this question a lot. I actually just got a question from a counselor 2 days ago, sort of on this similar with respect to the counselor recommendation letter. And you know, we don't have a preference on the stylistic choice that you make, whether it's in the COVID question, whether it's in the counselor recommendation letter. If you want to sort of hear a longer conversation on that, feel free to check out our counselor webinar that was actually just hosted on our by our admissions office. It's on our website on virtual events for counselors. But however you choose to communicate that is totally fine with us. We don't have a preference one way or another, as long as that information is communicated, as long as, you know, if it is an counselor recommendation, for example, as long as there's still urgency and great enthusiasm for your student, however you choose to do that is totally fine. And then there was another one that I noticed here. In light of whole person evaluation, how would you recommend students highlight their activities outside of the 10 slots in the Common App? And I think if a student has beyond the 10, I mean, there's no, I'll say like off the bat, there's no expectation that a student will have more than 10 activities. That is a lot. And especially with what's going on now, again, we always, and we've always tried to encourage students to include things that they don't think of as the traditional extracurriculars, like part-time employment, like family responsibilities at home. Those are actually really meaningful ways in which a student spends their time. But again, if there is anything else beyond that, prioritize the most significant, the most meaningful to the student in those 10, perhaps the most significant time commitments. If there is anything else outside of that, a student is welcome to include them in the additional information section.
Yes, and we have a question about fee waivers. We try to make it very simple for our students, applicants, and families. On the application, they will be able to select from a drop-down box their reason for requesting a fee waiver. It could be they're on free and reduced lunch, they've qualified for a fee waiver for the ACT or SAT, and that's it. You do not have to provide us with any further documentation.
I will say that can vary by school, and it does vary by school,
Exactly.
the level of documentation that may be required for that. So definitely ask your admissions officer about that, ask the financial aid staff, your financial aid officer about that as well, but it will vary by school.
Okay, team. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. Okay, awesome. I think we are at our mark. We're going to transition out. Okay, team. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. Just to make sure, that that we meet everyone's questions. Our Yale representatives has informed us that they will be following up with you all with answers to any unanswered questions. And so if you all don't mind just adding those unanswered questions in the feedback survey and include your email address, that would be great. We've included the link to the feedback survey at the bottom of your screen here. And this is going to be helpful for our team at Yale to also see how they did and just kind of give them a little bit more feedback on how to improve today's presentation. But team, I want to just make sure everyone takes some time out to thank the amazing Yale team for such a great, insightful, thoughtful presentation. We have been working on this presentation for a while now, so really happy to see it come to fruition. So thank you, Wendell, Eddie, Scott, as well as Corinne. And do you all have any parting words to share with our Greenlight community before we let you go?
I would just like to say thank you. I mean, I appreciate any time that financial aid can be a part of the conversation. It's critical for so many folks, and the work that all of you do to help students even get to our office is greatly appreciated. And so I just like to say thank you. Thank you for all the work you do, and thank you for the help for our families.
I'll say one thing really quickly. I think we're grateful to have our colleagues in financial aid who make our job in admissions easier with respect to affordability. That's something that we always try to communicate. Sort of similarly to Scott, I was a first-gen student. I couldn't go to college without a full financial aid package, and thankfully there are many schools that offer need-based financial aid based on family circumstances. So we've become evangelists for affordability in the college process. We try to encourage students and parents especially to think about looking beyond the cost of attendance. Oftentimes, they just slam that door in our face and say, this is twice the cost of what I make in a year. We get that, and we've been there. We know, we understand. We don't expect every family to pay the cost of attendance, right? That's why we want everyone to focus on what is the net cost to the family and to have that conversation early. And we're just grateful for all of your support in those conversations, because we know you have sort of that hands-on work with students. You hear their concerns. You probably maybe hear from parents as well, whether it's for a good thing or maybe a challenging thing. But those are very, very real issues that students are facing, and so we're grateful for your partnership in that and just communicating that message out.
Like Scott and Eddie, I am a first-gen student. And I did not have a great counselor in high school, but I was still fortunate enough to attend an excellent university. So I would say this: sometimes our underrepresented students and first-gen students may not know how to make themselves or pop in an application. So any advice that you can give them when they're discussing their activities outside the classroom and in their essay would be very helpful. Just don't allow their voice to get lost and their words to get lost in that process. So that's the best tip that I can give you right now.
Team, I just wanted to thank you all. I think, in the age of COVID, we really truly value the connections with real humans and our extended family. And it's really nice to know that our students have advocates on the ground, whether that is, our gatekeepers in admissions, all the way to our counselors who are working to kind of navigate those really choppy waters of admissions and financial aid for our students. So we definitely invite you to share this across your college access community, any students or families as an additional kind of supplemental aid in your conversations moving forward. We will be sending over the recording and the materials within 24 hours. So please keep an eye out for a follow-up email from me shortly. And then also, I wanted to just let you all know, if you enjoyed today's content, we do this every other Wednesday, and we actually are hosting our upcoming online college block party, which is our online student conference for first-gen under-resourced students. And so that will be next Wednesday and next Thursday between 7 to 9 Eastern. So make sure you mark your calendars, share it with your colleagues, students, and their families. We would love to virtually see you all there. And if you're not able to make it in real time due to extenuating circumstances or just 2020, please sign up anyway, and we'll be sending over the recording for you all to review at your convenience. Team, thank you so much for your time, and we're going to be signing off. I hope everyone enjoy the rest of their week, and please stay safe, and we wish you a very solid and sound mind in the upcoming weeks. Thank you, everyone. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.